Well, good morning. I count every one of you a blessing. Some of you maybe more than others, but each and every one of you is a blessing and a blessing to all of us for your presence here this morning. Thank you for being here. And thank you to those who are joining us online if you can't be here. We do have a lot of blessings in this life. But the greatest blessing of all is our salvation in Jesus Christ and all that will bring when this life is over with. I'll talk about that for a few moments this morning by using this passage in 2 Timothy chapter 4, verses 6 through 8. This passage that Paul wrote, some of the last things that he ever wrote, as far as we know. Because soon after he wrote these words, he was put to death. He was executed by the Roman government. He was beheaded. And he knew that was coming. He knew that he was about to die. And it did not bother him in the least. It did not concern him. Because he knew what was coming. And he writes about it here in these words. These are famous words that Christians often recite, especially at funerals, because of our faith in what is coming. So let's read these words together in 2 Timothy 4, starting in verse 6. For I am already being poured out as a drink offering. And the time of my departure has come. I have fought the good fight. I have finished the course. I have kept the faith. In the future there is laid up for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will award to me on that day. And not only to me, but also to all who have loved his appearing. It's so encouraging, those words. And they are certainly meant to be. Paul writes this letter to Timothy, his fellow evangelist, his traveling companion on occasion, his student. Because even though Paul is departing, Timothy's going to have to stay behind, and so Paul wants to encourage Timothy to remain faithful as he has been faithful, and he writes this letter, 2 Timothy, to encourage Timothy to continue in his work as an evangelist. But to all of us, the Spirit moved Paul to write this letter for all of us to encourage us to continue in our faith just as he had done. And so that's why these words are so encouraging, intended to be. I want you to think about the crown of righteousness that he talks about this morning. Think about what it is that we aspire to, what it is that we're striving for, what it is that we have as our hope. And it should be our hope. It should be your hope. As a child of God, this is what we look forward to. The crown of righteousness. It's intriguing, isn't it? The crown of righteousness which the Lord, the righteous judge, will award me on that day, Paul says. Well, that terminology, a crown, certainly evocative, and an image naturally pops into mind, the idea that we'll receive crowns. And we often sing about that, the crown, and think about it, what that will be like. But of course, Paul is writing in a certain context, a cultural context, and he's using language, in this case the Greek language. It's been translated for us, and so it's perhaps helpful to know exactly what it is that Paul is talking about by looking back at that language. And the word that he uses for crown is not the same concept that we often think about it, like a king's crown. You know, it's made out of gold and it's got jewels in it and maybe spiky things that come up or something like that. This crown that Paul refers to is the Stephanos. It's the garland wreath that was awarded to the winners in athletic competition. And it looked something like that. And it wasn't made of gold, it wasn't bejeweled or anything like that. It was just a garland of typically olive leaves. And you might think, well, what's so special about that? I could go out anytime I wanted to and find some leaves or a twig and wrap it around and make a leaf, put it on my head. And so, that's not really that special, is it? Well, it was in the culture. It was in the meaning of the day in which Paul lived, because it was something that was awarded to the winners, to the victor. It was a symbol, a sign of something significant in that culture. And here's a couple of pictures. There's lots of ancient urns and vases and things that depict the granting of the olive branch Stephanos, the garland. And you see that top image there. That's that woman who's granting that. That's Nike. That's the goddess of victory. When she is granting the victor the symbol of his victory. I didn't show the whole picture there because that guy's completely naked. Because in athletic competitions in Greece and Rome, they competed naked. But it was significant. It was important. It was something that they valued, the idea that you won the victory. And as such, often Caesar is depicted as wearing the olive branch victor, because when the general or the Caesar, when he won a great victory and he would ride in triumph through the streets of Rome, he would wear the olive branch garland to signify that he had won. And there's a picture from the 2004 Olympics in Athens. They repeated that practice of putting on those who won the gold medals the garland wreath, symbol of victory. That's what Paul's talking about. That's the victory that he's talking about. It's something that signified victory. It signified an honor, glory, something accomplished. And it came with certain privileges, often a monetary reward, but certainly a parade of honor, and you'd go back to your hometown after winning in the Olympic Games, and they would parade you through the streets, and you would wear your garland, and you would be celebrated. So all of that is the kind of the context, the rich, deep cultural context that Paul is using when he talks about this crown of righteousness. And there were some that were made of gold to give it permanency, you see, the idea that, you'd have this olive wreath garland, but it would turn brown and crumble. But now, make one out of gold, and therefore it would be beautiful forever. Well, not necessarily forever. Long lasting, yes. So here's my question to you. Is this you imagine that Paul's talking about? That when, after this life is over with, those of us who are rewarded by our Lord, that he'll put something like that on your head? Well, if that's what you think, then I don't want to undermine your expectations. I don't want to tell you you're wrong about that. Well, but I do want you to think about what Paul actually says. He says it's a crown of righteousness. What does that mean? Crown of righteousness. Well, as so often is the case, the Bible uses symbols to communicate concepts, and sometimes, being fleshly, material people that we are, we tend to concentrate upon the symbol rather than upon the concept. And so when Paul talks about the crown of righteousness, I don't really think he's talking about some golden piece of paraphernalia, some kind of physical thing. I think he means exactly what he says, the crown of righteousness. Righteousness. Look, for instance, at this passage in Psalm. It's a familiar concept, really, in the Bible, the idea of being clothed with righteousness. The psalmist says in Psalm 132 and verse 9, "May your priests be clothed with your righteousness. May your faithful people sing for joy." The idea of being clothed with righteousness, God's righteousness. That's perhaps more the idea of what we're talking about. Or this passage, for instance, in Isaiah 61 and verse 10, "My soul rejoices in my God, for he has clothed me with garments of salvation and arrayed me in a robe of his righteousness." Or this passage in Revelation 19 and verse 8, talking about that final reward that we shall receive. It was granted her, talking about the bride of Christ, the church, us. It was granted her to clothe herself with fine linen, bright and pure, for the fine linen is the righteous deeds of the saints. You see where a symbol communicates an idea, and the idea is wonderful. To be clothed with righteousness, to wear a crown of righteousness. You see, what it is that we're striving for is righteousness. God's righteousness. That's what we want. I know we sing about mansions and pearly gates and golden streets and wearing a crown and wearing a robe. I know we use that same language, and there's nothing wrong with that language. The Bible uses that language, but we need to understand what it is that we're talking about. And what we're talking about is God's righteousness, God's holiness, God's purity, God's goodness. There's nothing more precious. There's nothing more wonderful. And we can have it. We can have God's righteousness through Jesus Christ. So when Paul talks about what he's striving for, I have fought the good fight, I have finished the course, I have kept the faith, what is he talking about? What's he fighting for? What's he running for? What's he keeping? It's the righteousness of God, the goodness of God, the holiness and the purity and the love of God. That's what he's fighting for. And that's what he's running for. That's the race that he's running. He's running the race of God's righteousness, the race of truth, the race of salvation. And that's what he's keeping. That's what he's retaining in his life. So that's what he's going to get. The thing he's fighting for, the thing that he's running for, the thing that he's trying to keep in his life, that's what he's going to receive. The crown of righteousness. See, very often, we think about, okay, I just want to get through this church stuff. I just want to do all of these things that I'm required to do so that I can get done with this and get on to my reward and get that mansion or get that trophy or I don't know what it is that people imagine. Righteousness is the thing that we should value, the thing that we should want, a crown of it, granted to us by the Lord for having fought and run and kept. Paul uses this same analogy, the same metaphor, if you will, of the athletic games, and he actually refers to all three of the same things, the fighting and the running and the keeping. In 1 Corinthians chapter 9 and verse 25, beginning, he says, every athlete exercises self-control in all things. They do it to receive a perishable wreath, but we an imperishable. Therefore, I run in such a way as not without aim. I box in such a way as not beating the air. But I discipline my body and make it my slave so that after I have preached to others, I myself will not be disqualified. And there's the keeping. So there's the running and the fighting and the keeping. He says, I do those things. And year after year, hour after hour, moment after moment, Paul was struggling for what was right. And he was running. And he was keeping. Because he wanted an imperishable wreath. You see, even a wreath of gold, even a wreath made of solid gold will perish. But the wreath that Paul's talking about will never perish. That's what he was struggling for. I have fought, and I have finished, and I have kept. And those verbs are in the perfect tense. They are accomplished. They are done. Now, Paul had a little bit of time left in his life, but he had, through the course of his life, from the moment that he was converted and became a Christian, till that day, he had fought and he had run and he had kept, so that he could express and say at the end of his life, at the close of his life, I have fought and I have finished and I have kept. And those are verbs. And if you want the object of the verb, which is the crown of righteousness, if you want the object, then you have to do the verbs. I have fought for what? Fought for God's righteousness, and I have run for God's righteousness, and I have held on to God's righteousness, and He will grant it to me. You see, it is God's righteousness, and it is granted, it is given, it is a reward. And I don't mean to intimate, and I don't think Paul does either, that he earned it. And yet, he wanted it, and he fought for it. And he ran for it, and he kept it. You don't think those things were significant, that they mattered? You know, all analogies are imperfect. You can't press them to their ultimate conclusion very often. They fall at some point. But you understand the point. They're going to have the Summer Olympics in Japan this year. You're not invited, by the way. But say I did manage to sneak into the country, and let's say they ran the marathon, and there was a guy who won the marathon, and they brought him up there to the podium, and they were going to put the gold medal on him, and I snuck into the stadium, and I walked over there to the podium, and I stepped up on the podium right next to him and said, "Hey, I want one too." There would be some burly individuals who would come and take me away. That's what I would get. Because I didn't deserve the gold medal. And so that's where the analogy may break down a little bit. We none of us deserve the righteousness of God. And yet, we should want it and strive for it and fight for it and run for it and keep it. We should. And the Lord cares about that. What do you think Paul's talking about here? If none of that is material, if it's not pertinent, if it doesn't matter whether you fight or run or keep, yeah, it matters. And see, this is the problem so often when this verse is quoted by people at funerals, is that they often quote it in reference to people who did no fighting and did no running and did no keeping. And that's not appropriate. That's not right. So if you want someone to actually legitimately and appropriately cite this passage at the end of your life, as Paul cites it about himself at the end of his life, then maybe give some thought to what you're fighting for and what you're running for and what you're keeping, and whether or not it's actually God's righteousness. Because if it's not, then this verse doesn't apply to you. This is where Paul was. In all likelihood, this is the carcera, the prison underneath the it's called the Maritime prison. It's a dark hole in the ground. It's there on the Capitoline Hill in Rome, and it's where they put prisoners who were about to be executed. And that's probably where Paul was when he wrote those words. And that's what he's talking about when he's talking about fighting and running and keeping. So what are you doing in your life? And I'm not suggesting that we have to be like Paul or as good as Paul or as prolific as Paul was, and yet there needs to be something in our life that we can look at and say, this is me fighting, and this is me running, and this is me keeping. But it can't just be any fight, and it can't just be any course, and it can't just be any thing that you keep. It has to be the good fight. It has to be the course. It has to be the faith. And those definite articles are significant. You know the difference between A and the, right? A fight can be any fight. And lots of people are involved in all kinds of fights. But just any fight's not going to do the trick. It has to be the good fight we're talking about. We're keeping Jackson and Joby this weekend. And Jeremy and Katie are going to come tomorrow, and they're going to want to see their children. And if they show up, and we have some different children, and they say, "Where's the children?" I say, "Well, here's a child. Here's a child." The difference between the child and a child is significant for a parent, isn't it? Well, there's the good fight, the course. Well, what course is that? Well, it's God's course. It's the one He lays out, In the ancient world, they had fixed courses. They got them today, too. You can't just run whatever course you want to run and say, "Well, I ran a course. Give me the prize." It's got to be the course, the faith. There is something that God expects of you to learn and to follow and to do. The faith of the gospel. It's not just anything that you want to believe or anything that you want to do. It's what God prescribes. That's what you have to fight the good fight, keep the faith. God's faith. God's truth. God's gospel. You want God's righteousness? He'll give it to you. But you have to fight His fight. And you have to run His course. His faith. That's the way that works. Are you? I mean, what are you doing in your life to make sure that you are fighting the good fight, and that you are running the course, and that you are keeping the faith? I mean, there's lots of ideas out there, lots of doctrine, lots of gospels, lots of different ideas. And we're talking about this morning, continuing our class on digging the wells, redigging the wells, of making sure that we're on the right course, that we are practicing the faith. That's what that's about. And then Paul says, in the future there is laid up for me the crown of righteousness. And it is a future thing. You see, here's the thing. We do all of the pursuing and the running and the fighting for righteousness in this life. But there is a reward coming for that. And it is being granted God's righteousness. Not a righteousness of our own. I hope I don't give you that impression. We have to pursue righteousness and fight for righteousness, but in the end, it's not our righteousness that we want. It's God's righteousness. And it will be granted to us in the future. And I don't even know exactly what that will look like or what that will be like. We've got like I said, the symbols, the images, the ideas conveyed in simple language in the Bible, but I can't imagine that it's going to be exactly as we picture in our mind. The righteousness of God. That the Lord, the righteous judge, will grant His faithful on that day. There's a day coming. And the Lord is righteous. You seek the righteousness of God? Well, God has righteousness, and He is righteous. And there's no cheating, and there's no excuses. And there are lots of unrighteous judges in this life, people who will judge unrighteously and unfairly, who will attack us and who will lie about us and who will condemn us unfairly, as Paul was condemned unfairly, unjustly, and executed by unrighteous judges. But that didn't bother Paul, because he knew there was a righteous judge who in the end would grant him that crown of righteousness, will award me on that day. See, there's no timidity. There's no doubt in Paul's voice. There's no question. Paul didn't have to say, well, I hope he will. And by hope, he means maybe not. He will. And so when I say that we must fight and that we must run and that we must keep, that is not to imply that somehow we can therefore not be certain about our salvation, because we can know sufficient to the purpose whether we're fighting or not, or whether we're running or not, or whether we're keeping or not. It will grant me on that day. And not only to me. And here's the rub. You think, well, that's good for Paul, but what about me? Well, not only for me, Paul says, but also to all who have loved His appearing. And the only question is, you love His appearing. Are you pursuing the righteousness of God in your life? I ask the question because Paul, he knew Christ would reward him because he had been faithful. And that raises the question, are you faithful? Are you faithful? Well, the Lord's going to judge that, of course. But in the interim, it's a decision that you need to make as well, don't you? How do you feel about your life? Are you? Are you fighting the good fight? Are you keeping the faith? Well, you need to think about that. Wouldn't you like to be able to say at the end of your life, like Paul, you know, it's been hard, it's been difficult, but I've been in there fighting, and I've been running, and I've been keeping. And you know good and well what I'm talking about. You know what your life is like. You know what you're doing with your life. And if we want to have Paul's hope, then we need to engage in Paul's struggle. And not talking about perfection. I'm not talking about not making any mistakes. We all make mistakes. But are you in the fight? You know, there's a difference between fighting and not fighting, and running and not running. Are you running? Are you keeping? I hope you are. I know many of you are. But if you're not, and you know you're not, I mean, in your heart, you know you've not been engaged in the struggle. And you need to get back to it. You need to correct that in your life. Do it. Do it now. And if you're not a Christian, then you know. You know you've never obeyed the gospel. You've never started the race. You're not even in the race. You're not in the fight. Because you haven't confessed Christ and turned away from sin and been baptized in the name of Jesus Christ. Because that's what Paul did. That's when Paul started his run. When Ananias said, "Arise, Paul, what are you waiting for? Arise, be baptized, wash away your sins, call on the name of the Lord." That's when Paul started his race. If you haven't started your race, no crown for you. Get in the race. Get in the fight. And if you want to do that today, just let us know. We'll stand and sing a song of encouragement.